This story is called A Casket for Jean. After more than 6 years of marriage, time had taken its toll on the health of both Bill and Jean Rowe. Yet they soldiered on despite Bill's arthritis and Jean's advancing dementia. Bill was determined to keep Jean at home and look after her to the end, if that were at all possible. He remembered the vows that they'd made so long ago, but seemingly so still fresh, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, till death us do part. The old white pine outside the kitchen window had lost its top several years before, during a windstorm. Through their long married life, the tree had been a constant friendly neighbour. It seemed to keep guard over them and watch them through the kitchen window as they ate their meals. But the previous winter had been finally too much for its now frail limbs. Most of the remaining boughs had been brought down in a severe ice storm just before Christmas. And in the spring, Bill called his grandson Jason, who cut up what could be salvaged from the branches for firewood, and grandfather and grandsons burned the slash. Jason then felled the remaining trunk. In the intervening months, Bill had searched the internet for designs of plain pine coffins. It was of great significance for him to personally create a vehicle for Jean's mortal remains to depart this life when the time came. A casket constructed with his own hands would constitute a final honouring cadence in the symphony of their long love for each other. A year later, time had worked its magic and the wood from the old tree was now seasoned. Bill called Parkinson's, the remaining local sawmill. He had the old white pine's trunk sawn into 1-inch boards. Bill's arthritis was such that he could no longer trust himself to operate the skill saw, so he had the boards cut into pieces according to the shape of the plans he downloaded from the internet. Over several weeks, Bill constructed Jean's casket from the resulting casket kit. His labour of love was no mere box banged together with nails or fastened with screws. Instead, 5/16-inch holes were carefully drilled into the wood at 12-inch intervals around the edges of base, sides and lid. Then he lovingly sanded each piece of the pine board by hand, till it attained a warmth and soft smoothness that's only possible with pine. The exterior surfaces were stained and varnished, and the casket was assembled with 1/4-inch dowels. These were glued into place apart from the lid. Around the interior, Bill installed a series of 8x6 picture frames, into which he inserted photographs of his beloved Jean through their years together. The smiling girlfriend, the radiant bride, the proud new mother, and pictures taken at their 25th, 40th, 50th and 60th anniversaries. Each photo featured the smile that had so captivated Bill. Finally, he carefully placed the lid on top and wrapped the casket with plastic sheeting, protection until it would be needed. In late July, Jean's life began its final chapter. She could no longer get out of bed. She refused food and drink despite all Bill's ministrations. Bill did not call doctor or ambulance. He did not call son or daughters. Knowing the end was near, he realized that if either relatives or medical professionals were brought into the picture, the inevitable result would be that Jean would be taken to the hospital. There she would die in an institutional setting, with kindly nurses no doubt, but not in her own home, in her own bed, as they both agreed was what they wanted. Bill kept vigil over her, moistening her lips to keep them from cracking and holding her hand. He sang quietly to her as her breath became raspy, her cheeks pinched themselves in, and the last vestiges of consciousness drifted away from her. Bill stroked her hair. He kissed her gently. He told her unconscious form how much he'd always loved her, but that it would be all right for her to leave whenever she was ready. And in the morning, while Bill sat with Jean in his morning coffee, Jean's breathing became slower and shallower, until, after a few false endings, it ceased. Following his long-intended plan, Bill fetched a large bowl of warm water from the kitchen. He did not wish the services of a funeral home, nor for his beloved wife's body to be washed by a professional, a stranger. He called his son Robert, who lived a 2-hour drive away, to give him the news that his mother had gone. He asked Robert to let his 2 sisters know. He himself would begin to attend to the necessary details and be ready for them when they arrived. Bill laid thick towels on the bed. He removed Jean's nightdress and diaper until she lay naked before him. Next he began to wash very gently and tenderly the woman he had loved for so long, her neck, her back, her now skinny hips, how different from the curvaceous buttocks he had known and loved when bringing their 3 children into the world. Backs of her legs, soles of her feet. And he turned her over and washed ever so gently the face that seemed so peaceful in death, almost seeming to smile back at him in his task. The breasts he had so enjoyed, their fullness and firmness now long gone. Her pubic area, its dark tangle, now stringy and grey, but loved no less, and her legs down to the front of her feet. Finally he brushed out her grey hair, thinned out with time, in just the way she'd enjoyed through the long months of her dementia, until he was satisfied that she looked as she should. With these preparations complete, Bill sat quietly to say his final goodbye, a moment of greater significance to him than the funeral to come. He let the tears flow, and then he bent over Jean's body to give his final kisses, to her lips, to her 2 breasts, and to her pubic triangle, not in any way lustfully, but softly, deliberately, respectfully of their long years together. Then he fetched the clothes in which he had decided that Jean should be buried. Brand new underwear that he'd purchased months before for this very purpose and occasion. The suit she'd worn at the surprise 60th wedding anniversary dinner party the children had arranged for them. He wanted all these preparations completed before the children arrived or before he contacted the church minister. This activity had taken a considerable time, given Bill's state as an elderly arthritic gentleman. And by the time he was ready to dress Jean, rigor mortis had begun to set in. This made getting her dressed an arduous task, requiring considerable exertion. And as Bill lifted Jean's torso in order to put on the jacket of her suit, the effort became too much for him. And a mere 2.5 hours after Jean's death, her husband followed her into the next world, dead from a massive heart attack. He would not in any event have wished to live alone without her in the home that they had shared for so many years. Robert, Susan and Jenny arrived soon after. They let themselves in and called to their father. Receiving no reply, they searched the rooms on the main floor and then went upstairs. In their parents' bedroom, the children were greeted by the sight of their half-dressed mother on the bed and their father sprawled lifeless across her. Oddly enough, despite his meticulous planning, Bill had entirely forgotten the need to have his wife's death recorded officially. He therefore neglected to summon a doctor, probably conflating this obligation with his aversion having Jane taken away to hospital to die. Being of a more modern generation than their father, his children did what contemporary people are trained to do. Without taking in the significance of the sight before them, they immediately dialed 911. And despite the lack of urgency of the occasion, fire, police and paramedics were all on the scene within a few minutes. There being nothing that they could do, police and the firemen soon left, and the paramedics transported the body of Bill and Jean Rowe to the local hospital, where in due course the obvious determination was made that both were deceased. Still at the hospital, Susan put in a call to Barmer's funeral home, and later that day the 3 children made their way to the aforesaid place of business to make arrangements for the funeral. There appeared to be some confusion. When their mother's health had begun to deteriorate, the children had asked their father about what was to happen when finally she passed away. To this, Bill had replied everything was already taken care of. Children assumed that Bill had likely prepaid Jean's funeral with Barmer's, the only undertaker in town. However, Barmer's had no record of Bill having made any contact with them. Consequently, none of them had any idea as to what their parents would have wished. They decided on cremation, to be followed by an urn burial in a single plot at the Evergreen Memorial Gardens, so their father and mother would remain together in death as they'd always been in life. They chose appropriately modest caskets. Their parents had been modest people, and anyway, the caskets would be cremated along with their parents' bodies. From the funeral home they put a call through Forest Plain United Church, where they'd attended Sunday school many years before. They arranged a date for the funeral. When the will was read after the funeral, it contained the expected provisions that the family home was to be sold, with the proceeds divided equally between the 3 children. The latter, all long grown, married and well settled into their own homes, had little need for or interest in the family furniture or household items. They agreed to meet later to share out items of sentimental value. The house was put up for sale, which gave her urgency to prepare it for viewing by prospective buyers. It was only then that anyone thought to clean out Bill's old workshop. Jenny agreed to take care of this. She brought along her husband Ivan to see what tools might be worth keeping or passing on to grandchildren. They expected to find simply his old power and hand tools, along with dust and cobwebs. Jenny was completely taken aback to find a large plastic-wrapped object resting on a pair of sawhorses and occupying most of the floor space of the small workshop. When the object was unwrapped from the plastic sheeting, it revealed a handsome pine casket, stained and varnished to a high-gloss finish. Jenny recoiled in horror. A coffin? In Dad's workshop? Ivan took off the lid, and they saw the photographs. When realization dawned, Jenny broke down into uncontrollable sobs. Though this is what Dad had wanted for his beloved Jean, the arrangement that had all been taken care of. Not a cheap casket from the funeral home, but something he had constructed himself to demonstrate his abiding love for her. That was why they'd found him sprawled over their half-dressed mother on the bed. He'd wanted to carry out all the final rituals himself, rather than leave these intimate acts to strangers. In their shock, their grief and their haste, they'd been blind to recognize this, and so she, Robert and Susan had allowed the rituals over their mother's remains to be overseen by strangers, the precise opposite of what their parents had wanted.